Hello, namaste. Welcome to Dev's Hammer Show. This is weekly English talk show on Indigenous television and ITV Nepal. In these weekly episodes, we featurize in-person and sometimes online interviews of guests from different backgrounds. We discuss on Indigenous issues affecting Indigenous peoples worldwide. We share the experiences and foster a kind of collaborations among the communities. So we invite guests from different walk of life to discuss on Indigenous issues. So today we have invited a prominent scholar. She is no other than Dr.Lina Waimarie Nikora. She is the professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. And she is well known for groundbreaking research on the Maori psychology, the Maori indigenous people's well-being and their culture and so forth. So Maori is one of the indigenous communities in New Zealand. So first of all, before I start my conversation with Dr. Linda, I would like to welcome Linda to the show. First of all, welcome to the show.
Namaste.
Linda. So in the background, I said a little your positions, your background about connection with the universities as such. Could you please briefly introduce yourself so that our viewers actually are well aware about you?
Namaste. Thank you for your greeting and your welcome. It's just a joy to be here in Nepal. My first time to Nepal, but Nepal is very well known to people in New Zealand, particularly in relation to the Himalayas, the climbing community, and the like. So it is just, it feels very joyful to be here. So I'm here as part of the CPRID conference around Indigenous Research and Education, Indigenous-led research and education, which has been a passion of mine for my whole life. I really enjoy working with my own Māori communities, supporting them in their aspirations for the future, and providing evidence to support the steps that they want to take moving forward. So that's kind of like a little bit about me in terms of my research passions. I began life in the university as a psychologist, went on to become a professor in Māori psychology, and then more recently a professor of Indigenous psychology. That said, I have legs in two worlds. So while I very much live life in mainstream colonial settler New Zealand, I'm still very much part of my own tribal communities. So my mother is from the east coast of the North Island, so very much from the sea people, from Te Aitanga Hauti. My father is very much from the hill people, from Ngai Tūhoi. So.
Right. So, Dr. Linda, as I listened to your keynote speech as well, and I read your biography to some extent in brief, you specialize in decolonizing the Indigenous research or Indigenous educations. So, globally, the term decolonization actually has been so popular these days. Could you just define in simple language that how we understand that decolonization all about? Or when we talk about decolonizing education or Indigenous research, what is it all about? How we can understand?
So the term decolonization came about after the World Wars, where the world came to realize that empire was not such a great thing. And so you had colonial expansion across the globe to places like New Zealand, where the British set up colonial systems and government. And after World War I, World War II, they began to realise that they couldn't sustain that. And so we moved into a period in time where the world and nation states were looking to decolonise or decouple from their colonial attachments, if you like. So that idea has been taken into the research domain. So research has been very much taught from a Western perspective. It's a Western sort of take on a particular activity relative to knowledge generation. Now, knowledge is a really, really important thing. To have knowledge is power. And so when someone else has your knowledge, it means that they're actually quite powerful in that equation. So decolonising research is about decentering research away from the Western centre, reflecting back on the way in which knowledge is being constructed about us, and asking questions about how true, how accurate, how reliable is that knowledge, and is there a better way of doing that? And from our perspective, Indigenous frameworks, Indigenous knowledge bases, Indigenous ways of doing things deserve airtime. You know, they deserve a presence. And so from a Māori perspective, we are unapologetically wanting to control, to drive, to govern research, and to do research with ourselves and with our own communities.
Dr.Lina, as you said, the term decolonization is connected with something colonizations, but when we talk about Nepal, as a country, it was never colonized by outsiders, but then what we call is the indigenous peoples, what they call it, we were colonized inside. But then I could sense that what you said, colonization maybe doesn't mean that, you know, Western colonized, but as you said that, you know, our textbooks or, you know, modern classroom teaching influenced by the Western thoughts or philosophy. Is that the one, or how we can, as the indigenous peoples of Nepal, can relate the concept of decolonizations, which never was colonized by outside? How we can relate? How we can use that thought in our, you know, practice?
So, you know, we've moved through a period of neo-colonialism, globalization, and I guess we have to understand it in terms of there was a man called Fatali, I can't quite remember his last name, but he's from the Middle East, and he did an analysis of the three worlds, and I also add the fourth world into that as well. So he asked himself, who are the producers of knowledge globally? So when you ask about who are the producers, you're really asking about what infrastructure do they have, what capability and capacity and skills do they have, what means do they have to actually disseminate information around the world, and where do other nation states reside relative to those centres of power. So in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as a country, it's seen as a second world nation. We import our knowledge primarily from the US and Europe. That's where a lot of our knowledge comes from. The textbooks, even the teachers within our universities all come from outside of our country. They're valued more than the people at home are valued. So it's a new form of colonisation in terms of knowledge colonisation. So when we look to ourselves as Māori in a fourth world context, i.e. we live our lives in the face of a dominant majority all the time. We then have to ask ourselves, what is the state of our knowledge? Where is it? What do we want to do with it? How is it being treated by other nations, other knowledge systems around the world? How do we want our knowledge to remain in service to us for future generations?
Mm-hmm. So you rightly said about the knowledge. Whenever we talk about the knowledge, the indigenous worldview or indigenous peoples basically don't use the term traditional, but what we use the term indigenous knowledge. What role does the indigenous knowledge actually play in whenever we are talking about the indigenous research system, indigenous education system? In that way, what role does the indigenous knowledge play in this indigenous led research or indigenous education system?
So as an indigenous researcher, indigenous knowledge guides everything that I do. And it also puts a very clear ethical framework around all other knowledges. So, for example, as a psychologist, there's lots of Western world psychological knowledge. So that sits in one hand, and it's very, very powerful, very, very useful. As a psychologist, I've seen psychologists create absolute magic in people's lives. But that has to be measured and weighted against what I call my Te Ao Māori knowledge, my indigenous world knowledge, because oftentimes it's not a fit. But there are ways to find confluences for those knowledge systems to come together, and there are also ways and times when those knowledges should sit separately. So if we're talking about, for example, the university system, how does indigenous knowledge sit within the university system? In my mind, it has to sit very carefully, and I'll use the term gracefully, mainly because it's a knowledge that I feel is very precious to me, and very, very precious to our peoples. It's a knowledge that has gone for centuries without attention, mainly because it's been suppressed, and there is a need for us to sit and nurture that knowledge base. Sometimes it's appropriate for that to happen within the university system. Sometimes it's more appropriate for it to happen within our own communities. And in fact, there's some knowledges that the university should have no business with because it's uniquely, privately ours. So within the Aotearoa New Zealand system, indigenous knowledges have become part of, I would like to say, an ordinary part of the education landscape, but I know that is probably a little bit naive. My ordinary is not everybody else's ordinary in terms of the academy, but we're seeing indigenous knowledge in the areas of architecture, engineering, chemistry, physics, even the geneticists, astrologers, astronomers are all looking to the indigenous world, because that really is a totally unexplored frontier.
There are, whenever we talk about the indigenous knowledge, which is the indigenous community themselves are a oral community, not written one, oral community. So this knowledge has been passed through our generation orally. Now there is also discussion that the ongoing discussion is to document this oral knowledge into. So, could you share some of the example how the indigenous knowledge system have been documented? Perhaps we take a lot of example from New Zealand, from the Maori, how through the education nest, how they documented the elders' knowledge, and then how they preserved or revived the Maori indigenous language as such. Could you share some of the example that how indigenous knowledge can be documented, how this oral knowledge actually can be preserved for the future generation as such?
New Zealand, settlers began to arrive in New Zealand in the late 1700s to early 1800s. Major immigration, settlement, etc. And at that time, there were more Maori who were literate in the country than what there were settlers. A lot of the settlers weren't literate at all. So Maori, my ancestors took to new technology very, very quickly. We appreciated that things like nails, iron nails, were new products, were useful to us, could be bent to our will in terms of what we wanted that technology to do for us. So literacy was one such technology, and part of that was the beginning of documenting our narratives, our stories, our daily lives, and the like. Now, part of that period of time also involved land tenure, changes in land tenure, because settlers wanted land. And so in the colonial process, we had to prove our ownership to the land. And in proving our ownership to the land, we had to be able to establish our ancestral links. And in order to establish our ancestral links, we had to provide the evidence for those claims to be made. All of that was documented. It was written down, and that became the beginnings of our era of literacy. So that canon of work is there and is often accessed by us all the time because it's just a gold mine in terms of Indigenous knowledge. And then we came to the period of Māori attending university. So the first Māori graduates came out of university around about the 1900s, and there's been a constant trickle through the university systems since then. So now we have around about 1,000 PhDs. In New Zealand, the population of New Zealand is about 5 million. Māori comprise between 18 to 20% of the population. And so to have 1,000 PhD students, that's pretty much every community in Aotearoa, Māori community in Aotearoa, would have at least one PhD student, if not more. So what that means is that our capability for documenting, for recording, for interrogating, for growing our knowledge is in good hands moving forward. Yeah.
Actually brought the very important issues that in New Zealand, Maori indigenous peoples actually got higher studies now. They are controlling the educational research system as such. But and also I heard that the indigenous led research or education is important, as you said. But there is also another question as such. I heard a kind of presentation from the researcher or educators that indigenous led research actually something to do with the indigenous people's communities' involvement there, their ownership in the research, and therefore it is important. Could you share some of the examples that how whenever you do a research, when the indigenous led researchers doing a research in the ground, how they ensure the community's involvement, how do they ensure the community's ownership in their knowledge in whatever the document that is produced?
Yeah.
Would you share some of the thoughts or examples?
Yeah. So one, an Indigenous researcher is always asking the question, how will this research be felt by my grandmother, my uncle, my brother? How will it manifest in their lives? What difference will I make in the work that I'm doing to their lives over there? What benefits will come? So every Indigenous researcher needs to bring that frame right from the very, very beginning. Now, some research, and one would hope most research, involves engagement with, participation with, walking beside and with community. And my own experience is that when that happens, the changes that are imagined to be felt by those communities are more likely to be realised than if we were not walking in that particular way. Influence researchers in that particular direction, there's a number of mechanisms. So for example, funding. Most researchers are dependent upon finding funds to support the research activities. So sitting on funding committees, writing clear expectations for research with Indigenous communities, it's a really important mechanism. So a lot of the funding organisations in Aotearoa, New Zealand, have very clear expectations. And so if the researchers don't meet those expectations, they don't get the money. Other mechanisms are ethics committees. Ethics committees will ask the question, have you gone to speak with these people? What did they say? What did you do in response to what they said? So having really clear ethical standards and guidelines, and having Indigenous people sitting on ethics committees so that we can say, no, this is not ethical, this should not proceed. Go back and do it again. So mainstream researchers don't like us, they don't like being told no, but I think over the last 10, 20 years, within our country there's been a maturity around good research practice with Indigenous peoples. Yeah.
From your presentations, I sense that you're from Indigenous community, Maori community. I'm from Sunuwar Indigenous community. So this is, good if we take a lead in the research or education and go to the community and document the knowledge. But there is a kind of a skepticism that mainstream researchers, not from Indigenous communities, but non-Indigenous communities, because of this climate change, globalizations, they thought that there is a scope in the areas of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous things, so that they are going to the communities, and as you already said, that they have misappropriated the knowledge, whatever the document. So in that way, how careful should the Indigenous community be, or they should take in order to balance a kind of research conducted by non-Indigenous or led by the Indigenous peoples, or how they should trust, or whom should they trust. In that way, could you just give us a certain guides how the Indigenous should be careful on that, or share whatever they want to share with anybody they come to the community?
Yeah. So perhaps the first thing I want to say is that we are not God's gift to community. Just because I do research doesn't mean to say that the people in my community can't do research. The reality is that they are very, very capable of documenting our own knowledge, asking good questions, finding ways to get good answers. They are more than capable. And so I think first thing is to figure out, are researchers really needed? Do these people actually need these skills? from my own community in Kairawhiti, of a Indigenous group of some 5,000 people, we've got 3 professors. You know, so that's a lot of research power just within that group alone. So firstly asking, do we really need the presence of these researchers in our communities, in our lives? And that's a question for communities to decide. Even when it's your own. So, you know, even when I go back to my own communities, I have them ask themselves, do you really need me? Do you want me to be doing this? Because I've got other things to do. It'd be great to be sitting on the beach and just enjoying life. So that's the first thing. The second is, sometimes we do need researchers to help us answer questions that we have. So for example, in that community, post the cyclones, there was a lot of silt and debris that flooded over the land. So some of the questions that we had was, okay, what is in the silt? Is there anything poisonous in here? Am I safe continuing to live in this environment, etc., etc.? And so the community wanted that expertise. The government provided the expertise, but it was not on the terms that were negotiated with communities. So that was not a good example. So you have, you know, researchers talking to government, feeling empowered by government to do whatever they want, collect whatever information that they want. And so the pushback there is really on the government in terms of how they do things. So I mean, Indigenous communities have a lot of power, and we've just got to realise that power in terms of being able to say, no, you're not welcome. No, we don't need you. Or alternatively, you are skilled, we need you to do a particular task, you're going to do it in this particular way, and that's going to be meaningful to us.
All right. So, Dr.Lina, now since you're in Nepal now, attending the International Conference on Indigenous-led Research and Education, you share, I mean, in your university back in New Zealand, in the University of Auckland, there is Indigenous Studies. We also saw there are many universities which actually have introduced the subject called Indigenous Studies in their universities to attract the students perhaps from the indigenous communities in Nepal as well. For a couple of years now, yes. Indigenous Studies have been introduced. So since you have come here and you knew the presentations made by the Kathmandu University, which actually, you know, started this course, now other universities are also in the planning. So what is your observations? What is your thought? How these universities can you know, continue, or you know, the study, I mean, introduce their Indigenous Studies, why it is important, and what lessons we can learn from your universities back in Nepal, you know, in that way. Could you share some?
So Nepal is a totally new country to me. I've only been here for less than a week, and so my comments are simply informed by what I've been hearing in the conference to date, which is a lot of passion and energy for changing and presenting new opportunities to understand Indigenous studies, so not strictly only for Indigenous people, but for students who want to learn about Indigenous studies in Nepal, and perhaps further afield as well. I also suspect that there have been many generations of Nepalese people who have gone through the university system already, and that they just by mere virtue of the fact of completing a degree or even just attending university have become role models, have left a legacy for this new generation that's coming into the system. And I would also imagine that there are other Indigenous academics who are already teaching within the system in different discipline areas. So, for example, I started teaching in the area of psychology. There was no such thing as Indigenous Studies, but we created Indigenous psychology within the field of psychology. So what we tend to have happening within the university's system is pockets of Indigenous activity that have been occurring over time that then provide the impetus for establishing a concentrated program of learning that's all about Indigenous knowledges. It's all about us, about Indigenous studies as one of those evolutions. I'm also hearing about the possibility of an Indigenous university as a possible evolution. I haven't heard too much about what we would call tribal universities, which are probably more specific to particular geographies or tribal land regions. That's another permeation of how Indigenous knowledges may or may not be incorporated into the university institution. I think it's just fantastic. I think it's absolutely wonderful that these conversations are taking place and at such a high level. You have vice chancellors who are having this conversation, who are saying, this is what we want, this is the direction that we want to move in. That is just awesome. If we had people, our vice chancellors at home in New Zealand, being so passionate and enthusiastic, we would be clapping, we would be overjoyed. So it's wonderful to see that beginning to occur. And it's just watch this space. It's just going to, I think Nepal into the future for Indigenous peoples, if what I am hearing takes flight, then I think it will be a wonderful experience, a wonderful future. I'd love to be an Indigenous student in Nepal.
All right, so we have come to the almost end of the episodes. So I would like to request you perhaps give one-line message to the Indigenous peoples of Nepal or the universities that they are starting the Indigenous studies, right? Maybe a kind of a message for them last, or whatever you want. If you want to say anything that you want to add, but I didn't ask you, maybe at last.
Yeah, you know, I think for Indigenous peoples, we have to be the governors of our own futures. In order to govern our own futures, we have to be in control, we have to be at the table, we have to be part of the decision making, or the decision making, and we have to set the agenda. I feel passionately that we have the confidence, Indigenous peoples have the confidence, it is our time, and I think that we have answers that the world is waiting for. And so, you know, I wish everybody well, and I'm looking forward to continuing a friendship into the future. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Linda Waimarie, for joining us on the Dave's Hammer Show and sharing your insights in relation with the decolonizing the education or Indigenous-led research. Thank you.
Namaste. Thank you.
So with this, we have reached end of the show. That being said, the conversation will continue. If you have any queries or feedbacks, you can reach us at theindigenoustelevision@gmail.com. Please watch us next week. We will come with new episodes featuring new guests with fresh topics. By then, until then, have a wonderful weekend. Namaste.